What's going on, guys? It is Murderink here, back with another Raid Shadow Legends video. People have been asking me to review this upcoming rework patch, everything that it's going to come out with. I haven't really checked YouTube, but they said there's not a lot on this as far as an in-depth kind of breakdown on what's going to be happening in this new patch with the champions. There were a few complaints that people were nitpicking on a few topics and making these huge clickbait videos on them. Obviously, I'm not going to be doing that, so I'm going to go over the patch here, give you some things that maybe you missed when you read it. The question is going to be, are these nerfs and buffs bigger than we think or not as big as we think? That's the huge takeaway here. Let's get right into this. Update 2.2 by the lovely Valkyrie. Artifact Forge, spend more money. I get it, we're not going to go over that today. Charm, spend more money. We're not going to go over that. Advanced quests, nice addition for sure. Something to do. Okay, champion balance. Now, when I first read this, I did talk to them and I said, if you can, on the next type of rebalance thing you do, move back to the old system where they highlighted the old tooltip. Then they highlighted the new tooltip. They did a strike through effect on anything they're changing. Then they re-added it because some of this was a little bit confusing even when I read it for the first time. So Rodos, the Lost Groom, seems to be the huge topic that a lot of people are talking about. Is he going to be useless? Did they gut him? Let's see what happened. Attacks one enemy, has a 75% chance of placing a 60% decreased defense. Also has a 25% chance of granting an extra turn. Doesn't really matter. Vitality Plunder, so that A2 ability, damage slightly decreased, also not big. It would be nice if instead of saying slightly decreased, they gave us the exact amount, but I guess we're in the mystery here. Faded Destruction attacks one enemy, will ignore 60% of the target's defense, will also ignore unkillable and block damage debuffs. Enemies killed by this skill cannot be revived if this champion has max HP from the Vitality Plunder skill, grants an extra turn if this skill kills an enemy. Okay, so what did they do here? They took the kind of high point of Rodos being that revive champion killer. They made it much harder to make the block revive happen. He still gets the extra turn if he does kill an enemy. And they pretty much reduce his damage overall and reduce that extra turn chance on the A1. Is this huge? This is going to be really opinion based. Some people are going to say this is the end of the world. Others not so much. I'm kind of in the not so much category since there are champions who block revive just like Rodos does. Rodos, he's still going to hit extremely hard if you build him properly. Now, I actually built my Rodos anticipating this change about 2 weeks ago. So if you've ever seen me on stream with both my Rodos, one of them has an interesting gear set on. This is something that players actually used before, but the interaction is going to be a lot better with this. So I'm going to wait for this to go live and test it, see if it's going to be as good as I've personally in my head theory crafted to be. What this is going to do is this is probably going to change the arena meta a little bit. Now, you're still going to have to be careful. If people don't respect that this isn't a huge deal, you're going to get completely cleaned out by a Rodos. He still gets an extra turn. He still hits extremely hard. So the damage isn't really going to be noticeable. What is going to be noticeable is if you can't continue to get those kills with Rodos, the block revive obviously isn't going to stay because it's heavily dependent on the AI. Now, if the AI remains the same, one thing to consider is Rodos under a large shield from a shield set from a champion ability is going to do very, very well on defense. As we all know, and what's kind of frustrating at sometimes, it does seem like they kind of aim this towards his AI and how he works. So he's going to use that A2 first on defense if you've ever fought a Rodos, unless you're really low health. Usually you're not if you're going first or second against a team with the Rodos since he's a single target champion. So he's going to use that A2. If you're smart and you built enough damage, he's going to get that max HP from that A2, making his next A3 usage a block revive hit anyways. So I'm excited for this to go live to see actually how big of a deal this is. Moving on to Seer, the Lost Bride. Fills the turn meter of allies by 10%, places a block debuff, 60% increased defense, and 30% increased speed. Cooldown 6 now. Heals also allies by 10% of their max health at the start of each turn. Okay, so we know how our kit works. So a decrease in the heal, decrease in the amount of turn meter. Basically, you're going to just have to recalculate the speed of your team to make sure you're not getting cut in on. The heal, while it was good, this is more of a early game change, and not a lot of early game players do have CP. If you're playing against a champion with the CP, your goal is to one-shot whoever you're targeting, and that heal, whether it's 30%, 90%, or 10%, it's really not going to matter since the goal is to one-shot the enemy team. So that's where I stand on CP. I don't really think she had to be tuned in the first place. I think she was fine. All you need is a debuff stripper and you're pretty much good. I see why they do this. If you don't have a debuff stripper, that would definitely make fighting a CP very difficult and annoying, so I think that's a respectable change. Arbiter, Destiny's Call bug fixed the bug that had Arbiters filling the turn meter by 30% instead of 20% as a skill in 10s. Honestly, that's not a huge deal. 10% quality of life thing. Since it's a bug and not a fix, I guess we'll have to see how this plays out, but like I said, I don't really think this is going to matter. Let's just leave the two. They did revert that. That was probably a smart move by them because a lot of people were pitchforking severely over that. Madameceres has the ability to strip. It changed it from 3 turns to 2 turns. This is probably not the change people wanted to see. However, I think a lot of people are underestimating kind of how good this is. They said this was for PvE content only, which is actually not the case. If you've ever fought against the Madameceres, you know how long her cooldown duration is. Now the fact that the defense down and attack down is going to drop from your champions 1 turn before she has that ability to be used again, they're going to make a lot of these longer arena fights play out a bit differently, as opposed to her having that defense down and attack down up 100% of the time on the enemy team. Well, this was definitely a nerf for dungeons and clan boss if you were using her there. This is still something to consider. You're probably going to have better odds of beating a Madameceres in the arena, even though she still removes the buffs. She's not going to be able to keep those debuffs on you for an extended amount of time anymore, since she could just cycle her cooldowns or use the support tree for the chance of giving her a 4-turn duration. Now the max is going to be a 3-turn from a 2-turn. Next we have Coronar, has a 50% of decreasing the enemy's turn meter by 5%, and the rest of the kit stayed the same. Coronar definitely was annoying in the arena if paired with Manaya or if you put him in some type of retaliation set. So this is something that I've actually looked at before, and I do believe Coronar was extremely strong. I've showed footage of Coronar taking a very new player, and I pretty much brought his account in an account takeover from like Spider 13 I think, all the way to Spider 20 just because he had a Coronar and Manaya counter-attacking, reducing the spider's turn meter over and over again, so that was a bit broken. This is definitely interesting to see, and I think this was a respectable change as far as Coronar goes. Obviously, every single nerf, people aren't going to like it, no matter how you look at it, so there's always that to be said. Moving on to Blind Seer. Dark Shroud, 4-turn cooldown, so the key takeaway here is she's placing block debuffs first, then the shield, as opposed to vice versa, which would get her frozen against Torment. Now that's not the case, so that's pretty cool. As far as her A3, they removed the damage being inflicted to this champion. However, I don't think this is a huge change, because since she's an HP based champion and Dark Shroud did scale off of HP, you were building her with an insane amount of health as it was, usually running her with a healer. Definitely an improvement. I would have liked to see the cooldown dropped maybe 1 more time, but overall I think it's pretty quality. And her aura increased ally defense in all battles by 34%. Definitely good. Warlord, Orcish Rituals cooldown 5. Now we have Protection of Gods. Another way that we're kind of working in Torment here, making sure that Warlord's not freezing your team when he's applying that shield. Equal to 30% of this champion's HP. Warlord was good before, now he's a little bit better, so that's fine as it is. Next we have Kruchaxa, Curse of Writhing. Attacks one enemy, has a 75% chance of placing a 25% weakened debuff for 2 turns, has a 75% chance of removing 2 random buffs from the target, grants an extra turn. So I think the next 2 champions are going to fall under the same category here. Kruchaxa has always been a really good damage dealer, and she's good for what her role and her purpose serves. The only main drawback from a champion like Kruchaxa are her base stats, how squishy she is, and how you kind of have to build other champions guaranteeing she survives, as opposed to a champion like a defense-based champion or someone like Rodos who has a passive that's kind of a failsafe, making the enemy team need a multi-hitter to actually kill them. I think this is a good change for her. The increased chance is very good. They just improve the quality of this champion slightly, since her base stats were the main thing holding her back. The next champion we have here is Gurgle the Augur. Removes 2 random buffs from all enemies, has an 80% chance of placing a freeze debuff on all enemy, 1 turn, grants an extra turn. Adding the additional buff that can be removed definitely gives Gurgle the Augur some use. Base speed put to 98, so this is definitely a good change. However, once again, this is a champion based on their base stats that's very hard to gear, needing so much accuracy, still needing so much speed, even though the speed is at 98 now. He does have very high base attack. His base health is extremely low, so he is another champion who's very squishy, but this is kind of a change that I would have liked to see with Kutraxa to kind of even things out a little bit. Some change to the base stats, whether it was speed, defense, HP for Kutraxa, but for Gurgle, this should be interesting. It'll make him easier to gear to get him a high speed. I think the best Gurgle I saw that I attempted to build was like 310 speed with just over 400 accuracy. Now this is going to make it a decent bit easier, and making it so he removes 2 random buffs from the enemy is pretty good, especially against someone like a Sifi who has that block debuff and defense up. You could definitely be seeing a lot more Gurgle the Augurs, and I'm definitely looking forward to kind of doing some champion guides on all of these champions once this goes live. Moving on to Laliga. Disorient attacks all enemies, has a 75% chance of increasing the cooldowns of all enemies' skills by 1 turn, so this kind of turns her into a more reliable budget warlord, kind of someone like a basher. However, changing the cooldown, the fact that it only increases the cooldowns of all enemy skills by 1 turn means she only buys 1 turn. Now she does hit rather hard. I do use her in faction wars, so that is the plus from this champion, but overall, once again, another very small change to this epic champion. Now let's talk about Elder Scarg. Attacks 1 enemy 3 times. Everything seems to be the same except steals all the buffs from the target after the attack. This is pretty cool. I understand why they made it after the attack. This is very interesting synergy because you have to consider the following here. If a champion has block debuffs on, this champion is based on placing extra hits for each buff or debuff on the target. Now, most people in the arena are running a champion that provides block debuff, especially the higher you get in the bracket. So the fact that this champion places an HP burn and a true fear debuff for 1 turn, if this attack places all 3 extra hits and then steals the buff after the attack, this is kind of strange to me. Really what they would want to do is flip everything around, making sure that the buffs were stolen first, then that HP burn was applied, then the true fear was applied. Now they have been very tricky with their wording in the past as far as their kind of press releases and what's to come. So if this is in fact the case for Hunt the Marked, then this could actually be really strong. So once again, it's going to be up to Plarium how they actually implement this based on the tooltip. As it reads, it's going to be a little bit disappointing. However, I'm always up for being surprised, and I'm not going to rule that out just yet. Moving on to his next skill, everything there does seem pretty much the same. Now he's also placing a provoke debuff if he's fighting legendary champions. This is something that's really interesting because this is also a champion, as we see from a passive, who receives 15% less damage from legendary champions. So I do like that they added something else to his kit that also gives you a benefit when fighting other legendary champions here. As mentioned before, this wording is a little bit interesting. It does say also places a provoke debuff on legendary champions for 1 turn. However, this is also placed after these debuffs cannot be resisted. Hopefully, and I'm really hoping Plarium also applies the provoke as far as a debuff that cannot be resisted to make sure he still doesn't have to build any accuracy on this champion, which goes back to the last skill that hits 3 times. So there's definitely conflicting synergy here. Stealing all the buffs means you do require some accuracy unless stated otherwise. It does not say this debuff cannot be resisted in the first attack, but it does in the second attack, so it's kind of defeating the purpose of not needing accuracy. If to steal all the buffs you will need accuracy, so this is another thing that I'm not going to judge it just yet. I really want to see how it's implemented in the game before we go forward here. Now, the most unique change I want to say to this champion is his passive change, but more so addition. Inflicts damage equal to this champion's attack when attacked by legendary champions. Now, this is something I'm extremely interested in because, as we all know, I have a certain quality of gear. I can put extreme amounts of attack like we saw what I did with my Stophes. What would this do to an attacking champion if they do hit someone like Elder Scarg? That's what I'm really curious about, so I'm really looking forward to watching this play out live and actually seeing what stacking high attack on a champion like this is. This is kind of like a hybrid and variation of what reflect damage is. However, it's not something that can be stripped, so it's always static on this, making him a champion that might have to be targeted first. But also, if this stays true to how other damage scales, now what's really interesting about this ability is usually when some champion has some type of applying damage based on getting hit or based on being healed, usually it only scales off of crit damage, crit rate, and ignore defense. The fact that this is a reflection type skill that scales straight off of the attack can make this extremely broken and extremely overpowered, depending on how their scaling works with this and how much testing they actually did with this. So to my point before, if I put 8,000 attack, 100% crit rate, respective amount of crit damage in Savage gear, he might be one-shotting players who are attacking him, making him a serious threat to the enemy teams. Now the next champion is Kanjafun, the elusive, the person I haven't pulled yet, and since I'm not pulling shards anymore, probably won't get him unless I get very lucky. This is cool. I don't think this is anything insane. For a passive, this is much more respectable than it was, so I think this is definitely a good effect. I think the active effect is really cool. It places this perfect veil buff on the champion every time the enemy's turn meter is filled, and it cannot be removed, so this is something that can't be stripped, so on and so forth. I do like how they added the extra hit if the target does have any buff. Kanjafun does hit extremely hard. However, I'm not sure if an extra hit is going to do too much if that champion is under a really strong buff like a strengthen or increased defense buff. Now looking at On the Hunt, places perfect veil buff, 50% increased attack buff, 30% increased speed, and 30% increased crit damage buff. So basically they're making On the Hunt hit harder than it already did, and they're giving him a speed buff, so this could be an interesting champion. The fact that he's single target does take a bit away from him as far as what he can actually do, but for a single target nuker, I think he's going to be equally as strong to how he is now. They definitely did give him a few things to make him more viable early on in the game, with that increased speed and giving him perfect veil every time the enemy's turn meter is filled. But overall, I think this isn't as big as it may appear, since he's still going to be able to do the role he was initially built for just as well. Now we're moving on to our buddy Tormund the Cold. Going over his passive, giving him a 20% chance of placing a freeze based on a buff or a turn meter fill on the opposing team. The 20% chance applies twice per enemy turn, once for buff, once for turn meters, in cases where an enemy receives multiple of these effects at the same time. Does not work with artifact sets, turn meter filling effects from masteries, healing, or those buffs or effects that take place at the start of a round. Being completely honest, after really looking at this, what they basically did was, Tormund's still annoying, but he's not as annoying as he originally was, so I'm not going to hate too much on this. This is another champion where I have an alternate build that I've actually already made a video on, that I made in anticipation of this change here. So if you're interested in that, you can definitely find that video. I think that build's going to do a lot better than the current build that a lot of people are running. Using a stun set is still a viable option now that they're changing him a little bit. However, I don't think this is going to be a game-changing rebalance for Tormund. Now we're out here looking at by Stophes. So another point in really confusing wording with this champion, it's saying it has a chance of placing one skill, then it has a smaller percent chance of placing a True Fear on targets under that first skill that this champion already could have placed. So the question is, what happens first? This is basically a who's on first kind of thing. If they play this right, this means that if you apply block cooldowns, you have a 35% chance of additionally applying True Fear debuff. Hopefully that stays the case. The only reason why I'm questioning this and not just assuming is because Crumble, that ability, also attacks all enemies now, giving a 50% chance of the decreased defense for 2 turns, also giving a 50% chance of placing block cooldown skills, which has synergy with the addition to the A1 with True Fear. So once again, another thing that was, in my opinion, poorly portrayed on this website. They could have made it a lot more clear how they actually put all of these changes on here, instead of making someone like me making a video for you guys looking for actual insight as to what these changes actually mean are going to do, so we can kind of anticipate on how to either gear or prepare for these changes. Next champion we have here is Seer with the ability Lunge, attacks one enemy 2 times, each hit has a 30% chance of placing a stun for 1 turn. This chance increases to 100% if the target has an increased speed buff. Very situational. I don't think it's terrible, but once again, this is a very situational change, and I don't think it's anything crazy. He's going to be much better in the early game based on how much damage he can actually do, since Apothecary and Haikatun are very common to see in the early arena and all over the early dungeon stages in this game. Once again, he only attacks 1 enemy, so that's 1 kind of drawback on this to placing the stun. Next he has coup de grace. So this is a champion where they actually gave good synergy, but in the end it's all going to come down to that situational use in arena against a specific enemy. Now we have Bushi with deadly edge, attacks one enemy. This attack is always critical, placing a 30% increased crit rate and 50% increased speed buff on this target. Kind of interesting to see someone that always provides a critical hit getting 30% increased crit rate. While this can't have synergy with the rest of the kit, the smarter move would have been giving this champion increased crit damage or decreasing crit rate of the enemy team once he applies this, as well as that 15% speed buff. So overall, I don't think this is a huge change. It's really small. As far as Hexia, we have Gravera, and it looks like all they did was increase the chances that she had. Moving on to Soul Reap. The addition here was damage increases by 7.5% for each debuff on this champion, stacking up to 30%. This is something that's actually really strong. I'm sure people have known this by now if you have been watching my channel, but any champion that scales off of straight increased damage based on debuffs does a ton of damage. I'm talking Lord Shazar, Dracomorph. All of these things definitely add up to a lot of damage, so this ability, even if her multiplier isn't that good, is going to be hitting significantly harder if you can stack this all the way up to 30%. Moving on to the change in Spirit Harvest, the heal increases by 10% for each debuff on this champion. This is some more strong synergy because it also has to do with the amount of debuffs on this champion. Spirit Harvest definitely makes a lot more sense than Soul Reap does. I do understand that this is an epic champion, but the fact that you need debuffs on you to deal more damage is extremely situational unless you're pairing her with someone like a Gurgle. Moving on to Pitiless one, each critical hit fills the champion's turn meter by 5%, making this 10% total since it is a 2-hit. Damage slightly increased, so they're making him do more damage, giving him a little bit of a turn meter. Another small change there. Bone Keeper, I did look at this before. 50% extra crit damage. She does hit hard, so this makes her hit even harder. And this also gives her some more utility since she is filling that turn meter of all allies by 50% if she does kill an enemy. Missionary scales from champion HP, which is good in the thick, placing a 50% decrease attack debuff for 2 turns, scaling from champion HP once again. So there seems like they are fixing what these champions used to scale on, having it make more sense. This is a good step in the right direction. I think more champions that are mentioned on this list here could use some work as far as what they are currently scaling off of based on what they should be scaling off of. Next we have Humble the Faithless, decreasing the target's turn meter by 50%. That's always a good addition to any type of skill. And as we mentioned, once again, this is going to be scaled off of HP now. Now we have Jotun, Turvold's brother, looks really good in the game, scaling off of HP. We'll see how good they made the multipliers for this. Could be good, could be bad. Once again, this is something we have to test before really looking at and making a valid judgment on this. We do have Seer Away, damage increases by 50% if the target is under an HP burn debuff. 50% is a huge amount of damage to have scaled up high. So based on the multiplier of this skill, this could in fact be a mini Turvold in the making here. So that's something I'm going to keep my eye on and definitely test out once this comes to play. Now we have Tashata here, the change being the chance of placing the weakened debuff increases to 100% on critical hits, making her a much more consistent debuffer. Also, we have Spirit Appeasement with the cooldown being reduced to 3. Sleep does have a chance of granting the extra turn. Once again, it's RNG with more RNG following it, making it a questionable champion overall. Now we have Slobber Knocker, attacks one enemy, places a stun debuff for 1 turn, places it for 2 turns if they're under the sleep ability. So now they're giving certainty to applying a debuff under the RNG state of the first skill, which I do believe is kind of good synergy to have. You're going to make something as RNG as the first skill, especially giving it that option to having an extra turn after it. I think this can be very punishing, and this is kind of the direction you want to go with RNG champions overall, instead of kind of making them hit or miss as far as how beneficial they could be. Now we have Suai Firstborn. We have a 50% chance of placing a 60% decreased defense, so that's definitely good instead of having the weaker version on it. As far as the A2 change, I saw this is absolutely useless. Regardless of how much damage from the first hit is being taken from the second, the fact that it's always going to be normal and it cannot critically hit just kind of makes it useless. And all they did with Deeden reactions is give it a 75% chance of placing that weaken. Moving on to Taurus. Taurus was a very strange champion that they decided to give a buff to. He was extremely strong, but he wasn't widely used. They just gave him an increased chance of placing the weaken. He's very strong in teams that have a poison or a debuff snap champion like Xavia or Eleanor or Karam. So now he has an 8% chance of placing 4 or 5% poison debuffs on all enemies for 2 turns on top of an unkillable buff. Snorting Thug, basically what they did was he's stealing much more buffs. He was very useless before, however now they definitely gave him some pretty interesting interactions with stealing buffs. However, if he doesn't hit hard enough, he's probably not going to be as much of a nuisance as people may initially think after seeing how he's going to be constantly stealing buffs from enemies, really punishing them if they are applying buffs to themselves constantly, since he does have the opportunity to counterattack if they have no active buffs as well. So what they did with Rowan was a really interesting champion, and I kind of wanted to see them get rid of their speed scaling. I've tested this before. She can do a lot of damage, but it took a ton of gear and a lot of speed to do, so I was a bit disappointed to see they didn't change the scaling there. They increased your chance of placing the heal reduction, which is definitely one of the lowest used abilities in the game as far as a debuff goes, outside of something like Fire Knight. And then we have Scourge attacking 3 times, increasing that chance to a 40% chance of placing a stun, reducing the cooldown a bit. They could have made this an AoE and it would have been a lot better instead of attacking 3 times at random. That would have definitely been an acceptable change. Now moving on to Blade Surge, 4-turn cooldown skill upgrade now gives an increased chance of placing that poison, giving it a 75% chance. Moving on to Hope, they increased the chance of Sequester by 30% of placing that black buff debuff on the target. For Hurtin, they changed the shield buff equal to 25% of the champion's max health and reduced the Holy Storm cooldown by 4. Moving on to Canonist, Lead the Charge has a 50% chance now of placing that 50% attack. Blinding Assault, they added a leech debuff to be added, so this can definitely be used in some type of leech team. Moving on to Norog, we have Maul giving a 40% chance of placing black cooldown skills for 1 turn, which is definitely pretty cool. I do like his passive to Thick Skin. While it doesn't help endgame players, it definitely helps early to mid game players a lot, especially if you wanted to use him in the clan boss. This gives you 25% damage mitigation to all allies not under any active buffs. This gives 15% damage mitigation to allies under 1 or more buffs. So if someone gets unlucky, you have a speed team, someone outspeeds their crucial buff, you're getting an extra blanket from a champion like Norog, who, as I've shown before, does hit extremely hard in the clan boss, so this is something that I think is a good change for this legendary. As far as Astrolith goes, this is a very small quality of life change to Astrolith. Moving on to Hackhorn Smash Sword, we have the change here, removes all debuffs from allies, then places block debuffs on all allies for 2 turns, so he was strong before in this aspect, and now this kind of bumps him up a little bit, but once again this is nothing insane. Blood Offering sacrifices 25% of his maximum health. Really wasn't a huge determining factor before, so it's interesting to see why they use that now. Bellinor, what they did with his insurmountable ability is they made it so it places a perfect Veil buff on this champion for 2 turns, applies to Ascended Skill 2, very small change to this champion, giving him a little bit more survivability. Next we have Overkill, which is basically a replacement for what Draco had. Will attack the enemy with the lowest HP with any surplus damage if he in fact kills an enemy. What is interesting about Bellinor is what they did with the Tactical Partner. Activates this champion's Sword Leader skill, which is his current partner bonus, but it also activates Xavia's Poison Rain skill when Xavia is in fact on the same team. Interesting synergy there, giving Xavia more potential to use that debuff snap on enemies when you use both of them together. I'm going to be testing this out. This is probably going to be hard to pull off since you're going to have to make sure they're using the abilities at the right time, and it's all based on when Xavia is in fact using that A3, so this is going to be something I'm going to watch closely. Moving on to Abess, has a 75% chance of placing decreased defense. This should have been there in the baseline skill, so I'm really glad to see that that change was made. As far as Divine Wrath, it deals an extra 30% crit damage if the target's attack is highest, ignores 30% of defense if the target's defense is highest. She was already a good nuker before this, so this is just making her a bit better, and it's probably going to make some players who weren't giving her the respect she already should have deserved with Divine Wrath another look onto this champion to possibly insert them into their roster. Grip took Moss Spirit. I really wish they did more with this champion. Removes all debuffs except the poisons from the ally, so it's making it so they can cleanse any stuns you want, but leaving that poison on for that additional damage, which is nice, but I don't think it's the sizable buff this champion really deserved. Another small quality of life thing they did is they made him 2.5% poisons instead of 5%, making it less punishing to actually apply poisons on the team. This was a decent step in the right direction, but I really don't think it was good enough. So the huge Dracomorph nerf, surplus damage cannot be critical. This isn't really a huge deal. This is going to make it so I can't farm the Ice Golem in 27 seconds anymore. Not a big deal to me. I can't hit champions in the arena for over 1 million damage. Since it can't be a crit, it's still going to hit really hard based on the multipliers it has. Moving on to Drexstar Blood Twin, interesting because he is a fragment champion now. The addition to Burning Lash, this chance increases to 100% if the target is under an HP burn debuff, also placing that 50% decrease attack debuff for 2 turns if Provoke is in fact placed. So definitely some interesting synergy with the HP burn. What's even more interesting is what they did with the passive. This champion's resistance increases by 10 for every enemy under an HP burn debuff, stacking up to 50. So this is going to increase his value as something like a spider tank, for sure, giving him more resistance, allowing you to build less resistance on him as that off tank for spider, making sure those poisons aren't being placed on him. And it could have some interesting synergy in the arena, but all of this is going to have to be tested before really making a solid conclusion about what these champions can actually do. So those are the changes to be expected for what's coming up here. Give me your feedback. Who do you think is going to be really good? Who do you think is going to kind of just be okay after these changes? I think a lot of these changes were really small in the end of it. I have seen some people kind of making a huge deal out of this. I don't think anything was too insane here, but I'm definitely looking for feedback to see what you guys think. Do you think it's overreaction? Do you think it's justified? Give me your feedback. And as always, guys, thanks a bunch for watching. If you like this content, don't forget to subscribe, turn on that notification bell so you don't miss my next video, and I will see you all in the next upload.